We've been very pleased from the start to finish with what Lake Pipe Organ Company has been able to do for our church.
Thanks to James Leake and his staff for doing a wonderful job.
Good afternoon. I'm Deacon Ruth Anderson, Artistic Director of Arts at Holy Trinity. Welcome to those of you watching online and to those of you here in this room. We're glad you're with us to enjoy a live concert of wonderful music by a fabulous artist. Those watching remotely may download a copy of our program on our website, artsholytrinity.org. In its 38th season, Arts at Holy Trinity continues to share world-class artists and instructors with our community for free. This event is underwritten in part by Holy Trinity. We deeply appreciate the contributions of our corporate sponsors, patron circle, and other generous donors. Today's free will offering will go to Lutheran World Relief. 100% of the proceeds will support refugees fleeing Ukraine in the wake of the Russian invasion. Your contributions also honor today's Ukrainian-born artist and her loved ones. Lutheran World Relief is on the front lines, providing food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. We are grateful for your generous support in the midst of this crisis. Those of you watching online can make a difference by donating on our website or sending a check to Holy Trinity with LWR in the memo line. Those of you gathered here may place your gifts in the offering plates placed at each entrance. Thank you. At this time, we ask those of you attending here in person to please silence your electronic devices. To minimize camera latency for our online viewers, please turn off your Wi-Fi and disconnect from our network. We do not permit recordings or photography of any kind, except for resident photographers, Sandy DeLuca. Sorry about that, I don't know what's happening with that sound, but I'm sure our tech person will figure it out. Restrooms are located down the stairs behind you and through the door to your right, through this door, in the lobby area. If you do not have a church home, we welcome you to worship and study with us. Details are in your program. We welcome you to share your comments or questions in the chat on our live stream or in our offering plates. We will post the artist responses on our website in the coming days. If you'd like to share this wonderful experience with others, we encourage you to view this online on our website for the next week. CDs will be available for sale at this table to the right, at intermission, a brief interlude, or following the concert. What a pleasure to bring this amazing artist to you today, to share her talents not just with us, but tomorrow with area students and both in person and electronically. Please join me in a word of prayer. God, our Creator, we thank you for giving joy and delight to your people through those who are skilled in music and the arts. Lead them to develop more and more the gifts that you have given them, to dedicate their talents to your worship, and to serve your people in humility. Make us grateful for their efforts and move us to encourage and support them. Use them to bring echoes and reflections of your beauty to the ears and eyes of many, that having experienced your beauty, they may also seek your goodness and truth, and all for your love's sake. Amen. And now it is my privilege to present Ina Faliks.
So I want to tell you that the last time I performed this show, which I'd also recorded, was almost exactly 2 years ago. And it was the last thing I did before the pandemic, before all the closures. So I did this show, I believe it was in Boston or around there, and that was it. And then life stopped. And now here I am 2 years later, and it's been a rough 2 years in many, many ways for every single person on this planet. For me personally, it's been hard. Today marks exactly 5 months since I lost my mother, and you'll hear a lot about her in this story. She was one of my first teachers and a wonderful pianist and a great mom, and I miss her a lot. Of course, the war that began just a few weeks ago but has been brewing for a long time is nothing short of shocking and just impossible for me and many of my compatriots and colleagues, and really for all people to comprehend. So I, of course, condemn it, and I'm so grateful that you're here to support the refugees who have a chance to escape, although there really aren't as many as there should be coming to this country. But anyway, I can talk about this for a long time. I just wanted to share these two things with you. And before long, I hope you'll be immersed in this story of mine. And one more thing that happened that's a really good thing for me was that I got a book deal a few weeks ago. So what you hear tonight is going to be a book. And I've performed this show many, many times all around, and I've always been asked, is there a book coming out? Well, now, yes, there will be, about a year from now. So I hope you enjoy this. Polonaise Fantasy, the story of a pianist. It's my story, or a part of it, told through words and music. Today, I wake up every morning checking if my birth city of Odessa has been bombed or not. But back in the 80s, it was still ablaze with communist threat. Odessa Jews numbered in the hundreds of thousands until they started leaving for Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, to great Soviet relief. Yids, go home to Israel or any place that will take you. We don't want you here. We heard left and right. We eventually helped this number dwindle, this Odessa number dwindle at least by 3 because we left. I grew up in Odessa that no longer exists. I knew I was a musician long before I knew I was Jewish, Ukrainian, and Soviet. Red October was the name of our family piano. It stood neatly against the wall of my parents' room. It was a majestic, untouchable thing, and I pretended to play it with grand motions. It was an important citizen, and I had to treat it accordingly. My mother played the piano after coming home from work at her music school. I tried to do the same as her, but didn't press the keys for fear of somehow hurting them. After a while of observing me play the piano, my parents decided to start me on music lessons. My dad, watching from Chicago, I think, where it's not snowing for once, he still claims that he was the only Jewish child in Odessa who was not a musical wunderkind. However, he was the one who took me to music school on a tram ride through town. We passed the old church that became my favorite landmark. I waited for it and mentally said hello. I knew that I could not say hello out loud, for that would have been seen as weird, even politically incriminating. There was something forbidden dwelling there in those ruins, something that nobody could talk about. Ideas, beliefs, ways of being that were thought of as either archaic, dangerous, or both. Whatever people did in that church for hundreds of years was no longer permissible. There was no God in the Soviet Union, so my hello was sympathetic and inward. I was 4 years old, and I thought that I would soon learn to play the piano just like my mom, but instead I was handed 2 rather ugly wooden spoons, brightly colored, and I joined a Russian folk national instrument orchestra for children under 5. What a bummer. The piano came the next year. I loved the noise and ruckus of our apartment, Soviet Army Street number 50, apartment 2. It had 3 rooms with 7 people living in them. The piano room where my parents and I lived, the rug room. Now, a rug is a very typical ornament for a Soviet apartment. And the book room of my grandparents, the mom and dad of my mother. They were both doctors. He was always encouraging me to read a book a week. His typewriter had seen many underground pages, typed somewhere, retyped elsewhere, and typed again by him and passed on. So that's how I got my huge love for books. Great-grandma Fanny practiced Bach with me every day when my parents went out. You must play this with a dark and holy sound. At 6, I had no concept of a dark or holy sound, and I'm not sure great-grandma did either. I imagined something old, forbidding, eternal, like the church, like great-grandma herself. The memory of her talking to me about the quality of sound is so bright that I can smell and taste this sound still, a warm, throaty, purplish blue, serious sound. In the few years of early lessons, twice a week, and of course practicing, I learned sounds, scales, short tunes, and finally, I was ready to play small character pieces of Schumann and Tchaikovsky and Bach's simple, brilliant puzzles of intertwined voices. We spent summers in the countryside. One night, my best friend, Anastasia, and I made invitations. Grand summer night performance gala at the veranda, tonight only. We used dried pits from eaten apricots for tickets and wrote our programs on leaves. Family and a few neighbors showed up to find a stage decorated with colored paper garlands and me pruning my mother's gown and wide-brimmed hat. The long red dress was stolen from my mom's closet. The audience took their seats. My oversized dress crumpled to the ground, and I was left standing in front of them, fake microphone in hand, wearing only white underpants. I decided next time I performed in public, it would be best to wear concert dresses my own size. And as an aside, this dress belonged to my great teacher, Anne Shine, a fantastic pianist, and she gave this to me when I was her student at Peabody, but this story doesn't get there, so I thought I'd tell you. I didn't question why I had to practice. It simply felt as though sound I looked for ran away from me if I didn't spend many hours at the piano. When I started first grade, my best friend, the only kid in school who was shorter than me, was Misha Spiegelmacher, aka Spielka. He was a year younger than the rest of us and about 15 years smarter, judging by his knowledge of history, his caricature drawings, and in general, his impressively developed sense of wit. In fact, he was the first one to tell me that Stalin and Lenin were bad people, and I didn't believe him. Well, I believed him about Stalin, but not about Lenin. We were desk mates. So we sat at the same desk next to each other. These were assigned seats, and we exchanged pencils, erasers, and PG-13 drawings. Sometimes we skipped school to roam the city and visit bookstores and antique stamp shops, very rebellious for two geeky Jewish straight-A students. Soon I started composing very short pieces, and then I became obsessed with opera, because my parents took me to the Odessa Opera House, which you now see, of course, everywhere on social media. It's the symbol of the city. So they took me there. That was my first opera, to see Tchaikovsky's Iolanta and Il Trovatore of Verdi, and also Bizet's Carmen, and that was my favorite. Using the children's story, The Cat's House, which is a proletariat allegory with fluffy animals by Samuel Marshak, I decided to write and perform an opera, and that would be my libretto. With profound narcissism, I wrote the lead part for myself. After the success of my Cat House opera, my mother went to the notoriously reclusive composer who taught composition to college students in Odessa. After hours of pleading, she convinced him to take me on as a student. He treated me as an adult. He never joked or laughed or even cracked a smile, and dismissed my opera as total garbage. He was much more impressed with a few of the dark, short piano pieces I had written. Many, many years later, I visited him in Israel. His gravitas remained intact, but not his severity. He gave me a gift to honor our reunion, the Ballade in Black and White for piano. The word immigration popped up shortly after a memorable birthday party in 1988 when my dad's Aunt Dolly from over there, meaning the United States, suddenly appeared in our apartment bringing loads of extravagant gifts like gum and candy and pencils. Now, an aside here also, my previous performance 2 weeks ago, I was in Bellingham, Washington, and we had a reunion with this very lady, with Dolly, who now lives there, and I just played Chopin Concerto in E minor there, so that was very special. But anyway, they took us into the United States later on, but I get ahead of myself. So the word immigration was first spoken in our kitchen, and I kept hearing it like an echo during tea with my parents' friends, in their hushed voices at bedtime, caught in the chest of my great-grandmother, immigration, and whispered into my back by neighbors. Dad had begun to go on trips to Moscow, the center of the universe, to secure documents. Great-grandma sighed heavily. My parents began to take me to supplementary English lessons, and one day announced that we would be making a videotape of my playing the piano so that we could use it for auditions. The video was made in the concert hall of our music school, the Lenin portrait hidden by the bright red curtain. And I sort of wish we still had that memento, but we don't, because they thought it would be a bad idea coming to the US. It contains some of my own creations, Liszt, Chopin, and Mozart. Spielke was always walking me home from school in those days, and one time he said, "You know, Ina, you asked me something a few days ago, and I said no." "Well, I meant to say yes. You said I was in love with you, and I said I wasn't. Well, actually, I am." The words hung there in the air like a cartoon caption to one of his drawings. We mumbled goodbyes, and I ran upstairs to the apartment. Now, Spielke will be back in the second half, which is the romantic comedy of the show. Great-grandmother was waiting for me at home, and I came in shouting, "Spiegelmacher is in love with me." "You're 10 years old. This is too young to understand such things. Inachka." It was the predictable response accompanied by her kind, cackling laughter. Days later, we left for Czechoslovakia and then to Vienna, the first leg of our long journey to the US. as I said, Aunt Dolly and Uncle Ilya, their last name is Kerman, they took us into their home in Chicago. It was not a palace, but I never imagined that a family could live in a house like theirs, with large and small rooms, winding staircases, with stereo all around its brick walls, a blooming garden. I enjoyed that week off from the piano after practicing on a table a few hours a day throughout immigration. So yes, my mother, in order to prepare me and so that I wouldn't lose shape, she made me practice on a table 2 to 3 hours a day. It was especially hard when she would be like, softer, louder, and I'd be like, The Super Mario video game championship ended it ended forever, I might say, as soon as our first piano arrived. $200 spinet bought with the little cash my parents carried with them through immigration. Its arrival was a spectacular parade. Uncle Ilya's station wagon wore it like a hat, with my parents sitting on the roof of the automobile, supporting the wobbling instrument. Ilya succeeded against all odds and backed into the garage. By age 13, I learned Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto, Beethoven's sonatas, Chopin and Liszt etudes on it, and it withstood my abuse with dignity and still resides with the Kerman, where it perhaps hasn't been tuned since then, but I'm not sure. The great teacher, Emilio del Rosario's reputation of working with children and teenagers, making them into high-level concert pianists from the earliest age, had reached Odessa. The videotape of my piano playing had circled through a few sets of American hands and then reached his. I was invited to the Music Institute of Chicago, where he had taught for many years. The studio door creaked open and a joyous, rather high, fizzy voice laughed. "Ah, here is my next victim." A short man stepped out, immaculately dressed in a red blazer, black shirt, and perfectly tailored black trousers. Mr. D gestured me to the piano, and I immediately launched into my program. After I finished, he welcomed me, and I joined the tightly knit group of Emilio del Rosario piano students. He would take over and nurture everything that was already planted in Odessa, helping me become a performer. My most important hours during the next 8 years were spent in that studio. Immediately after my audition, Mr. D took me upstairs to the concert hall where a student recital was in full swing. He asked me to play part of my program, and I had no time to think, I just did it. Most of the school's administration were present, and I had just won a full scholarship to study with Mr. D. When the director of the school learned how much my mother had done to teach and prepare me, he hired her on the spot as a faculty member. And she taught there for 35 years. I played The Maiden's Wish by Chopin Liszt, and the wish came true. moved closer to the music school in a neighborhood that was more upscale than we could imagine or afford. Dolly and Ilya gave us their station wagon, and my parents took turns learning how to drive it. I started junior high, skipping 5th grade. On my first day of school, I took with me my pioneer's red scarf and some Soviet coins for show and tell. I quickly realized that most children at the junior high school were privileged and had an unfamiliar glossiness to them, a kind of polish in their clothes, their perfect teeth, sculpted hair, and shapely jeans. When asked, "Where did you buy those jeans?" I didn't think it's uncool to name a large discount drugstore. I couldn't understand why some kids would ask this repeatedly and with glee. A sympathetic girl took me aside and said, "You better tell them the Gap." I'd never had to face malice from other children, and I began to feel the hostility no longer veiled by roundabout questions about my jeans. "Your eyebrows look like Brezhnev's," an especially erudite boy informed me. I begged my mom to pluck them thin, and while she was at it, to straighten my hair. I didn't tell my parents about all my school troubles until much later. I didn't want them to regret bringing me here after all that they went through. I had a separate, wondrous life as part of Mr. D's piano studio. My very first few lessons, he kept repeating mysterious one-syllable exclamations. "Thumb under, use the wrist, weight in the fingertips." I didn't know these words, but somehow knew exactly what he was teaching me. A few weeks later, Mr. D felt I was prepared to enter the world of his Saturday night workshops. Once you became a student of Mr. D, the workshops were a non-negotiable part of existence. No other plans ever on Saturday nights. The most feared sound that could come out of his mouth during those events was Mr. D was a perfectionist, and this click was involuntary and frustrating. I'm going to try it again. It's hard to do. That's better. His tongue snapped peevishly against the mouth ceiling, impressively projecting through the concert hall acoustic into the frenzied, adrenaline-packed awareness of the performer. This mannerism became so ingrained in our psyche that we would expect it and even produce it ourselves with the inevitable occurrence of wrong notes. The click was not just a reaction to a blemish, it was communicating to us a plethora of ideas about discipline and expectations. It meant a musician strives for perfection. Music deserves no less. If you can't work for it, don't do it. When I first heard the term competition, I imagined the International Tchaikovsky Competition. The first contest I was put into was the Illinois Young Performers Competition. The winners would appear in a live televised broadcast performing their concerto with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, hosted by a national celebrity. When I got to do it, the host was Christy Yamaguchi of the Olympic figure skating fame, and she was stunning, but I was disappointed because the year before that, I didn't get it, and the host was Neil Patrick Harris, and I had a huge crush on him. Before the young performer walked onto the stage of Orchestra Hall, a bio snippet of his or her story appeared on a giant overhead screen, visible to both the live and TV audience. I was filmed in a shopping warehouse, showing the contrast between my childhood in Ukraine and my teenage years in a place of bounty. I had to run down the aisles of the store with a shopping cart, throw random objects in it, and say with an ecstatic smile, "There are many differences between Odessa and Chicago, but the main one is shopping." It reminded me once again that I didn't fit in. Mr. D appeared at the end of the segment. He looked intense and said into the camera, "Ina is so emotional." A quick cut to that year's Olympic gold medalist, Oksana Bayul, breaking down in tears. How important that event seemed to us back then. How badly, since the first month in my dear teacher's studio, I wanted to win this, and how frustrating it was not to win for a couple tries. How far-fetched it all seems now. The notion of a competition being an all-encompassing event. But it gave all of us a sense of responsibility, the gravity of solid months-long preparations for a given performance. And it gave me a debut at 15 with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. My parents allowed me to travel to performances on my own when I turned 16. The first solo trip was to Knoxville, Tennessee. I played in a Golden Dome museum, accompanied by an office printer to my Chopin Nocturne. After that concert, Mr. D announced to my mother, "I want to take Ina to Japan." And on that tour in Japan, I repeated the same program many times in different halls and cities. Mr. D never gave big compliments to his students. His strongest praise would be a grunt under his breath. But after the last concert, he said, "Good." Then I knew he was pleased. Mr. D passed away some years back, I think 6 now, from a rare form of cancer. During one of the last times I visited him, he was still lucid. The recovery center had an upright piano, and I played some pieces for him from my newly released CD, some Rachmaninoff, Ravel. I asked if he wanted to hear something in particular before I left. "Play Chopin's Polonaise Fantasy." This always had been one of his most beloved Chopin works. I'd never been more ashamed of not knowing a piece of music. When I learned that nothing more could be done to save him, I flew to his bedside from New York to Milwaukee, a day before an important New York recital. I asked the nurses to bring a keyboard to his room, and I played the entire New York program for him, following it with some pieces I learned with him when I was very, very young. Mr. D's sister told me he doesn't recognize anyone anymore, I think. But he took my hand and he squeezed it with the might of a pianist in his prime, and I knew that he knew me. There were tears in his eyes. How grateful I was to be able to say goodbye. After he died, I learned the Polonaise Fantasy. I wish so much that I could have played it for him when he asked. I'm so glad you're here. No two of these shows are alike. Every time I do things a little bit differently. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter, and today I'm talking more. So the second half is snappy, and it's a romantic comedy. So I hope you laugh. Everybody needs a laugh now. So the second part takes me to Peabody Conservatory, and I probably just got my undergraduate. I'm in my master's. So, in case you think that by the 18th century the Medicis were finished, Princess Amalia di Medici, a zaftig, elegant cross between Botticelli's It Girl Simonetta Vespucci and Miss Piggy, will remind you that her family invented civilization, that she played most of the Beethoven sonatas by age 10, and most importantly, you don't need to be grateful, just don't be so ungrateful. She was a masterpiece of self-invention, Amalia, and she was a patron saint to the young pianists of Peabody Conservatory, where I went. Upon reaching drinking age, or not quite, pianists were allowed to audition for her and a panel of judges, and then would be invited to play at a festival in Toulouse. And the pianists and other musicians had recitals in Toulouse and in Carcassonne. They would play chamber and solo, spend quality time with Amalia, and enjoy European joie de vivre. Some of these pianists were later invited to play at Carnegie Hall. For these professional engagements in prestigious settings, we had to adopt all of her rules and agree with all her outrageous comments, including "my family invented Western civilization." A week before I left for Toulouse, practicing and taking too many email breaks, the name Misha Spiegelmacher appeared in my email inbox. After we both left Odessa, he to Israel and I to Chicago, we wrote each other long, elaborate, illustrated letters between Holon and Chicago. His particular brand of Odessa humor, combined with an intelligence and spark that I had since failed to find in men of 12 or older, kept him in my consciousness throughout years of relationships, dating, and a failed early marriage. He was writing to me after 15 years of silence. called him Špilka. My written response to him was, "Holy shit!" he said, get your salsa shoes ready because I'm coming to Toulouse at the time of the music festival and we're going dancing. No pictures were to be exchanged before the festival, and we had a code phrase, and that was, would you please draw me a sheep from The Little Prince? It's, because Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, he lived in Toulouse. So always a sucker for this kind of clandestine adventure, reunions, codes, and literary references, I agreed. I expected nothing from the sudden reemergence of my childhood friend, only to spend a little time in a fantasy. I wanted to find him the same now as he was then. I hoped to slide down the rabbit hole into the diorama that was my childhood in Odessa. My mother, as always, worried, do you really need this now? You know he's probably not your type. Will he distract you from practicing? What will you wear? So we agreed to meet in a Toulouse cafe. And of course he was late. And I was getting very annoyed because I sat there at this cafe and I looked around and I thought, is this him? No, is that him? That looks like that could be him. And so this person sees me looking at him. Of course, he starts looking back at me. This being France, he starts coming towards me, about to buy me a drink. And I don't know how to lose him. And suddenly another guy comes from behind me with a backpack and he says, Ina. And that's the guy. So a thin, athletic guy with clever, kind eyes, slender, elongated features, and a giant backpack was hugging me. I spoke the requisite phrase, can you please draw me a sheep? Spielke took out a folded piece of paper with a pen drawing of a sheep munching grass on a small planet, and we still have that piece of paper framed in our bedroom. I not only missed a friend's afternoon recital, but also the scheduled train to my next 2 days of performances in Carcassonne. I asked Spielke to come with me. I was sure we could find him some place to stay. It seemed that we'd only skimmed the surface of the past 15 years, hurriedly switching between Russian and English. His language was peppered with Israeli expressions and gestures, and it was so unfamiliar to me. On the train, I stared into his face and couldn't place the boy within the man and vice versa. And this collision of images, the now and then, was making it hard to breathe. More than anything, I suddenly wanted to be by the piano. I was really angry with him, all of a sudden, for having made me spend the day away from the piano. Now, pianists are either practicing or wishing they were practicing, and they usually hold other people responsible for this problem. duration of the Toulouse Festival, and I knew one of the rooms would become vacant. So I thought, Spielke, maybe you should stay there if the Countess lets him. We walked into the Cité de Carcassonne, where our inn was supposed to be located, and I heard a familiar roar coming from the first open door on the street. Quelle horreur! It was a rotten, terrible performance. I wanted to press a button and make him go away. Amalia was presiding over a long table. There were 2 empty chairs. I sat down with Spielke next to me and quickly ordered for both of us before she had a chance to interfere. Ina, my darling, I was so worried. I'm glad you made it. Is this a friend? I managed to catch her in benevolent spirits and was not about to lose this opportunity. Who, him? Imagine we ran into each other after all these years completely by accident in Toulouse. The conversation slid from the unfortunate concert to that very complex topic, the Middle Eastern conflict. No one's ever had a good dinner discussing that. Learning that Spielke had spent a great deal of time in the Israeli army, she broke into some uninhibited commentary that clearly made him uncomfortable. And he said, I don't think this is a good subject for dinner. And disaster seemed averted, but she pulled me aside. She had that look in her eyes that I learned to decipher. You disagreed with me. You're toast. She didn't like him. So she said to me, don't you get mixed up with this guy. All these liberals, they're a nightmare. They will destroy our country and theirs too. They will use you every chance they get and leave you dry. And after that, I could hardly inquire if the liberal could please stay in that hotel room next to mine. So I just asked him to stay there, hoping she won't notice. I was aware this may have been seen as a little bit forward, but I wanted to help him. He had no reservations and prices were terrible. This was the height of summer season. The group left and Spielke and I lingered a little while longer. Why did you stop writing me? I finally asked the question that has been on the tip of my tongue this whole time, and his entire being changed from easygoing and fun to fiery and extremely focused. I wanted so much to write you, to connect with you, to understand you, where you were, what you were doing and learning. But the Ina I knew, the one with that big bow, she didn't exist anymore. There was a young concert pianist in a very different country and culture from mine. I just felt like I was losing the thread that tied us together. I knew nothing about music. I could contribute nothing to your life in the way it was developing. You were playing recitals and winning competitions and writing to me about your great teacher. And well, after my father died, I had so much to do, so much responsibility. I felt it was best to let each other be. Silently, we walked to the hotel. I decided I would try not to think about all this. I had to focus on the music I was to rehearse the following day. In the morning, we waited until everyone in the group left so that we would not be seen leaving at the same time. That voice in my head woke up. You're here to rehearse and to play a concert and a professional engagement. Childhood friend or not, the audience must be moved, the presenter happy and ready to invite you back. What are you doing? Tell him you have no time for him. It was nice to see him and you have work to do. However, I had nowhere to practice before rehearsal, so we spent it exploring the medieval city behind the walls. Eventually, I had to go to rehearse and went to the church where the piano was. It was comforting to dive into the music in the darkness of the empty auditorium with a few flickering candles. The empty church, the mystery of the music, this newly found presence in my life of a person who connected me to the world I came from, a world that no longer existed. I played, and then I looked toward the slice of light in the door, and he was standing there listening. course, Amalia was very angry. She went into a tirade about me being so wild and throwing this crazy party with an ultra-liberal Israeli guy I picked up. I told her that it wasn't some guy. My best friend from childhood had come to see me and hear me play. Things were completely innocent, but she didn't believe me. This was all totally off. I didn't know whether to laugh or throw things. Again, and I felt a nasty irk of annoyance at Spielka. Why did he have to come here and meddle in my relationship with the festival? I was grateful to Amalia. She had brought me to Europe many times. She'd given me numerous opportunities to play in Weil Hall at Carnegie Hall. Spielka, elegantly dressed, waited for me outside and escorted me to the concert in silence. Misha, after the concert, there's a reception and dinner, but I'm not sure it's a good idea for me to bring you. It's nothing that you did, but Amalia is a little extreme, and I have to smooth things over. It was the first time I'd spoken his actual name in 15 years. He seemed calm as always. Of course, I understand. At the concert, the church was packed and the audience warmly appreciative. I noticed Amalia walking briskly towards me afterwards, and something snapped inside of me. I wasn't going to this dinner. Misha was waiting for me in the lobby of the hotel, reading a France guidebook. I asked, "What would you like to do if we could do anything?" "I'd like to go to Paris with you. I've never been." 3 days later, on the train back from Paris to Toulouse, we drank wine from the same bottle, ate sandwiches, and kissed. I phoned my mother from the Toulouse airport. "What am I going to do?" I was crying big, uncontrollable tears and looking at the sheets of paper stained with the sandwiches and filled with little cartoon drawings that he did. 2 years and countless concerts and airfare miles later, I stuffed a New York City taxi cab with balloons from the 72nd Street party store, crouching on the floor of the cab as it took me to our first apartment on 103rd Street in Central Park West. No more excruciating goodbyes in airport Ben Gurion, O'Hare, Kennedy, Milan Malpensa, LAX, etc. He was coming here to stay, and I was about to fill our first apartment with balloons. Later that summer, after the Toulouse trip, I received a call from Amalia. We hadn't spoken since the night of my performance in Carcassonne. "Darling, I'm so sorry. Would you like to play at Carnegie Hall again?" "Okay," I said. I still sometimes hear Peabody Conservatory rumors about a wild pianist in this story. Misha did get himself signed up for a life with piano. Living with music, structured, unpredictable, stately, inward, confident, yet searching. Like Polonaise fantasy, music of conflict, of adventure and mystery that Mr. D loved so much. Music is too sacred to be put into words, as if describing it, like speaking God's name, conflicts with its mystery and its power to be here, long after we're gone, to live in each performance, each reincarnation.
you.